Hi, I'm Amy Nielsen, editor of Seed World US, and I'm here with Sam Crowell from ASTA, and he's going to talk to us today about a topic that we're all concerned with, tariffs. And so, Sam, what is the current situation?
Well, thanks, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here, and I know that this is a topic that's on everyone's mind these days. When you say the word tariff, sometimes it's not entirely clear what that means. So I'll try to do my best to summarize what's been happening over the past 6 weeks quickly. The short answer is that the current administration here in the United States has announced several different forms of tariffs on imports of products into the U.S., effectively increasing the cost of importing products by 25% across the board. Tariffs are effectively a tax on an import, right? So the tariffs announced back in January were instituted under a broad range of economic authority that the president has called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. And using that authority, the president has the ability to effectively declare a national emergency around particular imports and then institute tariff policies as such. This is a little bit different than the tariffs that went into effect in 2019, which were instituted under a different set of authorities. In the prior round, under the first Trump administration, those tariffs went through a broader range of public comment period. There was opportunity for stakeholder feedback and for analysis of and justification of why those tariffs were necessary at the time. And that process played out over several months, if not a year or two. Whereas under this new authority, the president is effectively instituting tariffs by executive order overnight.
Right. And I remember back in January and February, it was just such a fluid situation, changing even hour by hour. And now I guess we're changing more by the day or the week. But do you foresee a time when this is going to settle and all the retaliatory stuff is going to start calming down?
It's a good question, and I wish I had a clear answer for you. We're all watching and reading the same news cycle, I think, these days. So you're right. When the president instituted the tariffs in late January, he originally announced that they'd go into effect on February 4th. They were particularly targeted at Canada and Mexico and China at the time, and they were broadly applied to all imports of products coming into the United States. So shortly thereafter, Canada and Mexico reached out at very high levels to the president's team and kind of brokered a pause in those tariffs through March. The tariffs on imports of seed from China have been in effect effectively since February, raising the cost of importing seed from China at first to 35% tariff rate and now to 45% tariff rate.
So what is the real impact on the seed industry of these tariffs?
Well, in the short term, I think the hardest part for us all is navigating the uncertainty around timelines and scope of coverage, right? So, as I mentioned, the tariffs were paused on Canada and Mexico in February. There was a 1-month extension on those tariffs effective March 4th. The president announced they would be going into effect again. 3 days later, they were paused again, but only for a certain subset of products. So in the interim, all of that uncertainty really does create a lot of questions around, how and when will seed be impacted. On top of that, our trading partners are beginning to announce their own actions through retaliation. So when we put a tariff on their products, they, in some cases, are proposing to put tariffs on our products. And so, in the context of how seed moves globally, I know many of our members, many of the folks in the seed sector know this very well. We move product all over the world for seed production, seed cleaning, seed amplification, testing in different breeding environments. Effectively, every time that product crosses an international border, it is checked by a customs official and they have to make a determination whether there's a tariff imposed, right? So if you were moving seed back and forth, in this case, between the U.S. and Canada or the U.S. and Mexico, you would have to take into account a 25% tariff rate on seed coming into the United States. And then if Canada or Mexico retaliate, you'd have to assess whether there's additional tariffs going into their countries. So it gets quite expensive quite quickly.
Yeah.
And the uncertainty around how and when they will be implemented is creating a lot of waves in the industry these days.
And what specifically is ASTA doing right now to advocate for our industry? I know it's affecting independent companies just as much as it is affecting the large companies. We're not even making a differentiation at this point. But how are you fighting for us, so to speak?
Yeah, Amy, it's a really good question. So there's lots of things going on quietly behind the scenes here. So I'll do my best to summarize. So the first thing is really getting the message out. What products are impacted? How will it impact your businesses? What do we know? Where is the uncertainty? And how do we get information from our seed companies on what that means for their bottom lines, right? So we've, since February, have been sending out messages at least once a day, if not twice a day, to a wide range of ASTA members that are involved in trade in North America, just to keep them up to date on all the changes, which, as you said earlier, are happening hourly.
Yeah.
While we get information out to the members, we're also really actively engaging here in DC with our counterparts in the federal government. So, as I mentioned earlier in this interview, the president and his inner circle are really driving a lot of the tariff policy these days. And so in the first month of the administration, it was quite difficult to be in contact with political officials in the executive branch because it really was the president and a handful of advisors that were rolling these announcements out. Now that we have a new Secretary of Agriculture and more political officials in place in different agencies, we're beginning to have meetings to express our concerns, to submit requests for workarounds. We are also actively communicating with elected officials on the Hill in the House and the Senate about the cost that these tariffs represent for our businesses. And then separately from that domestic engagement, I'm in contact daily with our overseas counterparts in our sister organizations like Seeds Canada, the Mexican Seed Association, AMSAC, our colleagues in Europe and Euroseeds, to communicate why retaliatory actions are just as scary for us as domestic tariffs, right? So we're very well coordinated. We all have the same concerns. We're all communicating to our governments about what these tariffs might mean for businesses. And we're really hoping that that the message will sink in.
What can companies do?
It's a good question, Amy. I mean, I think it's, first of all, come talk to us, right? Please let us know what is happening at the border. You know, for example, I can tell you several ASTA members have already shared with me that the queues at the Mexican and Canadian borders are longer than ever because it's not just seeds that are impacted by these tariffs, it's every product, right? So everyone is racing to get their product into the United States before the April 2nd exemption on tariffs expires. So there are massive delays. And we wouldn't know that. We wouldn't know to communicate that out to the seed companies that you need to be building in extra time if we had not heard that from members.
Yeah.
I think the second thing you can do is provide us compelling stories about what it means in terms of real term dollars for your businesses. I can tell you, I've heard examples anywhere from $300,000 within a single growing season for a seed company all the way up to several million, if not hundreds of millions on downstream products in terms of added cost just for tariffs in North America alone. Mm-hmm. So that is a very compelling story. And we are sharing those facts with elected officials and hope that resonates so that they understand what types of costs this could represent for our farmers and for consumers in the downstream ag value chain.
Sure.
I think the third thing you can do is call your elected representatives, right? So for everything ASTA does on your behalf, you can also be doing on your own. So you can pick up the phone, you can call your counterparts on the Hill, you can write your members of Congress, you can reach out to the Department of Ag, and you can tell them why this is such a scary prospect to do business. If that feels overwhelming, we obviously are always happy to help and share what we're engaging and how we're engaging. I'll also just take a chance to put in a plug for ASTA's upcoming Leadership Summit in June. We're having a big meeting here in DC between June 8th and 11th, where we will be doing a large visit to the Hill to meet with members of Congress and discuss a whole range of issues impacting the seed sector. And I have no doubt this will be top of the list if things have not changed. So that's an amazing opportunity for companies to come and join us as a coalition to raise these concerns.
Yeah, I hope it's a really successful event this year. On another topic, this Mexico GMO corn ban. Can you provide just a little clarity and insight into what's really going on and kind of help some of the misunderstanding around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the most recent announcement coming out of Mexico is that their lower house has voted to ban the use of GM corn for cultivation in Mexico. So what they've effectively done is they've taken longstanding domestic policy and enshrined it in their constitution that, they're not interested in growing GM corn. As I understand it, that is not a stark departure from what's always been going on. The prior issues we were having around, reductions in approvals for important biotech traits and the trade disruptions that was causing under USMCA are unrelated to this action. And so, back in January of this year, the Mexican government announced that they are beginning to reissue approvals for biotech traits. They've admitted that they lost the dispute under USMCA, and as far as I'm aware, things are starting to return to normal for trade for many of our agricultural commodities. So your big exports of corn and soybean and other products that are intended for animal feed or human food should not be impacted by this most recent announcement.
Well, I really appreciate that clarification, because if you read some of the stories out there in the media, you think, oh no, we're not going to be able to send our corn anymore. So that's really helpful, Sam. And I'm sure you guys are keeping watch on that situation, as it isn't finished yet either.
Yeah, Amy, you're exactly right. And I think it's a really important example of where trade agreements really work, right? So, we challenged Mexico under the dispute process that was agreed to within the USMCA when their ag biotech ban went into effect. And we won that in legal court, right? The courts came down on our side and said, yeah, that ban is not in alignment with what you agreed to under international treaty through this trade agreement. And so Mexico had to roll back its ban on the import of corn. I think building on that, when we start to look at other trade actions like tariffs, there are a lot of really interesting questions around what the future of trade agreements looks like and how we leverage agreements like that to accomplish the goals and the interests of the seed industry. And so if folks are interested in learning more, I'm actively coordinating with our members on those issues as well.
Great. That's great. Thanks, Sam.